Grizzlies are among the most solitary creatures in the animal kingdom. They roam vast wilderness alone, hunting and searching for mates, fiercely guarding their territory. Any intrusion by another animal, or worse, a human, can trigger a swift and violent response. Join us as we discuss exactly what happened when their habitat was disturbed. On February 17, 2025, the wind howled through the barren expanse of the Kamchatka Peninsula, its icy fingers clawing through the landscape. Snow had been falling for hours, thickening into a blizzard that turned the world into a swirling chaos of white. Visibility was near zero. The sky and the ground had merged into one vast, featureless void, where the movement was little more than a shadow against shadow. The 5 officers trudged forward, their heavy boots crunching through knee-deep drifts, their breath coming in short bursts, crystallizing in the air before vanishing into the storm. They had been sent to investigate recent bear sightings near a remote village, a task that had started as routine. A few villagers had reported a Russian grizzly wandering too close to their homes, its massive form appearing in the outskirts like a ghost of the tundra. When food was scarce in the dead of winter, a desperate bear could be unpredictable and dangerous. They had set out just after dusk, hoping to reach the area before conditions worsened. But the storm had turned against them, swallowing the landscape and cutting off all sense of direction. Their radios crackled uselessly, static drowning out any attempts at communication. The village was already miles behind them, and the trees that had lined the path had long since vanished into the storm. They were alone now, 5 figures moving blindly through the white abyss, their hands gripping their rifles more out of instinct than preparation. Then came the silence. The wind still roared, but something had changed. The world felt too still, too expectant. Their footsteps slowed. In the thick whiteout, shapes shifted and reformed, tricks of the eye created by swirling snow. Shadows stretched where there were none before. Deprived of sight, the mind began to imagine things lurking just out of view. But this was no trick. A shape emerged, vast and hulking, barely distinguishable from the storm. It moved fast. Before anyone could react, the Russian grizzly was upon them. The first officer didn't even have time to raise his weapon before the bear barreled into him with the force of a freight train. The impact sent him sprawling backward, his body vanishing into the snow as the beast's massive paws came down, the weight crushing his ribs like twigs. A strangled gasp was lost in the wind as claws raked through his uniform, cutting deep, red blooming against white. The bear wasted no time. Its jaws clamped onto his skull, a sickening crunch tearing through the air before his body went limp. The second officer managed to get his rifle halfway to his shoulder before the beast turned, its eyes wild with primal fury. It lunged, swiping with its massive claws, catching him across the chest. The force sent him tumbling, blood trailing through the air as he landed in the snow. His breath came in ragged gasps, pain exploding through him. He tried to crawl backward, fingers digging into the ice, but the bear was already on him. Teeth found his throat. His struggles ceased. The third and fourth officers ran, instincts taking over, but the storm was against them. The snow was deep, dragging at their legs, slowing them. The bear followed, its bulk moving through the drifts with terrifying ease. It caught one of them within seconds, its jaws clamping onto his back, yanking him off his feet. He screamed, arms flailing, fingers clawing at nothing as the beast dragged him into the storm. His cries faded, swallowed by the wind. His body was never seen again. The fourth officer kept running. He had almost made it out of the bear's reach when the ground gave way beneath him. A hidden slope, buried under the snow, sent him tumbling downward. He hit the ground hard, dazed, his rifle lost somewhere in the white abyss. He scrambled to his feet, breath ragged, only to hear the heavy footfalls behind him. The bear descended on him. There was no fight. There is no time for struggle. A single swipe shattered his skull, his body collapsing, still twitching as the snow quickly covered him. The last officer stood frozen, rifle clenched so tightly his knuckles had gone white. His mind refused to process what had just happened. 4 men were gone in seconds, their bodies vanishing into the storm. The bear turned to him now, steam rising from its bloodied fur, its breath thick and heavy in the frozen air. He raised his rifle, but it was too late. The bear charged. It was a blur of fur and rage, a force of nature. He fired once, twice, but the shots were wild, panicked, lost in the wind. Then the beast was upon him, its massive frame crashing into his, the impact sending them both to the ground. He fought and struggled, but there was no stopping it. The bear's jaws found his neck, a twist, a snap. His body went still. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the storm reclaimed the night. When backup finally arrived hours later, there was nothing but silence. The snow had covered most of the evidence, erasing the struggle, smoothing the land into an undisturbed white sheet. They found the first body half buried, his head nearly unrecognizable. The second lay a few meters away, his uniform soaked through with frozen blood. The third and fourth were gone, taken by the beast or buried deep beneath the drifts. The fifth had bled out where he had fallen, his face twisted in the final moments of terror. The bear was gone. Tracks led away into the wilderness, disappearing into the storm. Search teams followed them for days, but the beast had vanished, swallowed by the endless expanse of Kamchatka's unforgiving wilderness. The village, once wary, now lived in fear. No one ventured far from their homes. Doors remained locked at night. The story spread quickly, whispered between hunters and rangers, told in hushed voices as a warning. The bear had come, and it had never been found. The town of Talkeetna had always embraced its isolation on the edge of the Alaskan wilderness. With fewer than 1,000 residents, life followed the seasons, the mountains looming in the distance, the wild pressing against its borders. For most of the year, people coexisted with nature. But on April 15th, 2022, something shattered the quiet routine. Spring was late. Snow lingered, the air stayed sharp, and the bears, sluggish from hibernation, stirred in search of food. One grizzly, driven by hunger, wandered into town. Bears occasionally strayed near, but this one was different. It had no fear of humans. The bear was first seen on the outskirts, lumbering through the snow. By afternoon, it had reached the main street, drawn by the scent of fresh coffee from the local cafe. Inside, 4 patrons sat at small tables, savoring warmth and quiet. Then the door crashed open. A hulking shape filled the doorway, fur matted with snow, breath heavy. The bear had expected food, not people. Panic set in. Chaos erupted. The bear lunged forward, claws raking against the floor. Chairs scraped as patrons bolted. A man in the back stumbled, his coffee spilling as he hit the ground. The bear, already on edge, swiped. Claws tore through fabric and flesh. The woman seated closest to the door had no time to react. The bear's claws swiped out again, catching her arm as she attempted to flee. The force of the swipe sent her sprawling, her arm bleeding freely as she tried to crawl toward the exit. Panic filled the air, racing footsteps and frantic breaths, mingling with the bear's low growls and the scraping of its claws on the tile floor. Amid the madness, the cafe's chef, a young man who had been working behind the counter, grabbed the nearest weapon he could find, a fire extinguisher. With a quick pull of the pin, he aimed the nozzle at the charging bear and sprayed it, unleashing a cloud of freezing foam directly into its face. The bear recoiled, its eyes narrowing in confusion and anger, momentarily stunned by the blast of chemicals. The bear staggered back, shaking its head as the foam clung to its fur, blocking its vision. For a brief moment, the world seemed to freeze, everyone holding their breath as the bear stumbled away, disoriented and irritated. Still in shock, the patrons stood frozen, their hearts pounding in their chests. The bear, its retreat slow but deliberate, finally turned and stumbled back toward the door. Its massive frame moved with surprising agility for such a heavy creature, its eyes wild with confusion and frustration. When the bear reached the threshold, it paused, giving one final look back into the cafe before lumbering into the snow and disappearing into the wilderness. The door swung shut behind it with a low thud, and the cafe fell into an eerie silence. For several long moments, no one moved. The only sounds were the heavy breathing of the patrons and the soft whistling of the wind outside. The woman who had been injured clutched her arm, the pain evident in her wide eyes as she struggled to sit up. The man who had fallen lay on the ground, his leg bleeding, his body still trembling from the shock of the attack. Still gripping the fire extinguisher, the chef slowly lowered his arm, his face pale but determined. It wasn't until the sounds of sirens reached their ears that the reality of the situation began to sink in. The town was in shock. No one had ever seen a bear come so close to the heart of Talkeetna. No one had ever imagined it would charge into a cafe, attacking people without provocation. The small town, once untouched by such violence, now found itself reeling from the aftermath of a close encounter with nature's raw power. Authorities arrived within minutes, followed closely by paramedics and wildlife officers. The woman's injuries, though serious, were not life-threatening, and she was quickly attended to. The man who had fallen was treated for his leg wounds, though he too would recover. The cafe, once a peaceful place, had become a scene of chaos, its floor littered with overturned chairs and spilled coffee. The chef, who had managed to defend the cafe with nothing more than a fire extinguisher, was hailed as a hero, though he was reluctant to accept the title. After assessing the situation, the wildlife officers began tracking the bear. Despite its efforts to retreat deep into the wilderness, authorities eventually located, captured, and safely relocated it. The bear's unusual behavior, driven by hunger and a lack of fear toward humans, had raised concerns, particularly after it boldly entered a building searching for food. With the bear no longer a threat, the town was reminded of the unpredictable nature of the wilderness it called home. In the following weeks, local businesses took action to prevent future incidents. New bear-proof doors and windows were installed, and safety measures were implemented to ensure patrons could enjoy their coffee without the fear of a wild animal crashing through the door. The incident would forever change the quiet life of Talkeetna, a stark reminder that the wilderness, even in the modern world, could always reach out when least expected. The people of Talkeetna will never forget the day the bear came to town. Though the wounds healed, the memory of that chaotic moment lingered long after the snow had melted. The Arctic cold was unlike anything Felix McAllister had experienced. The wind cut through his clothing, numbing his fingers and biting his face. Yet, there was an exhilarating peace in the isolation of the Arctic Ocean's shores. It was March 16th, 2024, and Felix had spent weeks in the frozen wilderness with a research team studying the impact of climate change on local wildlife. Today, he was alone, collecting data on polar bear tracks while his colleagues worked miles away at camp. The landscape was an endless white expanse, interrupted only by rocky outcrops and the distant, ice-bound sea. Stark and beautiful, it was also menacing in its silence. Felix had trained for Arctic dangers, wildlife encounters, sudden storms, but nothing prepared him for the deep vulnerability of walking alone in this frozen vastness. Polar bears, apex predators of this land, were especially aggressive in winter when food was scarce. Though attacks were rare near the research camp, the bears had been moving closer to shore, following the thinning ice. That was why Felix was here. As he scanned the snow for tracks, he failed to notice the subtle shift in the air. The silence thickened, and the wind carried an unfamiliar scent. He hesitated, sensing something was wrong, but the landscape appeared unchanged, silent and endless. Then, the world erupted. A massive polar bear emerged from behind a jagged snowbank, its white fur blending perfectly with the surroundings. It had spotted Felix long before he sensed it. Moving with terrifying speed, its eyes locked onto him, body low to the ground. Felix barely had time to react before the bear was upon him. Everything became a blur of raw terror and instinct in the few seconds that followed. Felix's first reaction was to run, but the snow, packed from the day's earlier winds, made his movement sluggish. He slipped, trying to regain his balance, but the bear was already upon him, its massive paws crashing down as it tackled him to the frozen ground. Felix's breath was knocked out as the bear's weight pinned him to the icy earth. He could feel the sharp, cold bite of the bear's claws raking through his clothes, tearing at his jacket and skin as the animal attempted to drag him further away from the relative safety of the shore. Felix struggled, adrenaline surging through his body, his heart hammering in his chest. He kicked and tried to use his elbows to push himself free, but the bear's strength was overwhelming. Each swipe of its claws left deep, searing pain, and each attempt to escape was met with brutal force. The bear's massive jaws opened wide, snapping inches from Felix's face. He could feel the heat of its breath against his skin, the animal's eyes locked on him with a predatory intensity. His body screamed for him to run, but he was trapped. His arms were pinned beneath the bear's weight and he could barely move. Felix tried to twist his body to fight back, but the bear was relentless. It moved with the kind of single-minded focus only a predator could possess. Felix's world narrowed to the sound of his frantic heartbeat, the screech of his breath in the frigid air, and the terrifying growl of the bear as it prepared for its next attack. Felix's thoughts raced. He had been trained to handle bear encounters, but nothing had prepared him for this. He had expected the bears to retreat if threatened. He had learned the warning signs, the body language, but this one wasn't retreating. It wasn't merely defending itself. It was hunting, and he was the prey. Then, as if the bear had decided it had wasted enough time, it dragged him toward the water's edge. Felix's vision blurred from pain and the cold, but he could feel the terrifying force of the bear's grip pulling him toward the frozen sea. His body was in shock, his limbs growing heavy, each movement feeling slower than the last as the cold gnawed at him from all sides. He tried to scream and kick, but the bear only tightened its grip. Felix was pulled across the snow, closer and closer to the icy water. He was dimly aware of the cold ocean lapping at the shore, the waves lapping quietly, but it was drowned out by the storm's roar and the thrashing chaos of his struggle. Just as Felix's mind began to slip into the cold, numb fog of unconsciousness, he heard the distant sound of voices. His colleagues, his team, had arrived. They were too late. The bear held Felix under the water, its immense weight pressing him into the freezing depths. Felix fought to breathe and claw his way back to the surface, but the pressure was overwhelming. His body went limp, and the world went dark. His last moments were a mix of disorienting sensations, clawing at the ice, the taste of salt water, and the unbearable weight of the bear's grip. The team arrived moments after Felix's life had slipped away, the bear vanishing into the snowstorm before they could intervene. They found him floating lifeless in the frigid waters, his body frozen and unrecognizable, the marks of the bear's brutal attack etched deeply across his limbs. It was too late for rescue, too late to escape. The team stood helpless in horror as the weight of the loss settled over them. It was a tragedy no one had expected, a cruel reminder of how unpredictable nature can be. They had known the dangers of working in the Arctic and the risks of encountering wildlife, but nothing had prepared them for the devastating reality of this loss. The bear was tracked down days later, its enormous footprint marking the landscape like a grim signature. Wildlife officials were quick to euthanize it, deeming it too dangerous to allow to live in such proximity to human habitation. But the damage had been done. Felix McAllister's death marked a turning point in Arctic research protocols. Safety measures were reevaluated, and researchers were instructed to take extreme precautions in bear territory. But the loss remained, a gaping void in the hearts of those who had worked beside him, a man dedicated to the environment, whose life was taken too soon by the very wilderness he had sought to understand. The morning of May 24th, 2024, it was cold in Wyoming. The sun had barely risen, the peaks of the Teton Range still dark against the lightening sky. Snow from the previous winter clung to the edges of the forest, melting slowly in the early spring warmth. There was an unsettled feeling in the air, a heaviness that clung to the land after weeks of reports. Stories of a grizzly bear behaving unusually aggressively around human settlements near Jackson Hole. The creature had become bold, wandering close to homes and businesses, rooting through trash bins, and entering yards in broad daylight. It was an alarming situation, and the community was on edge. Officer Michael Jennings, 40, had seen the aftermath of such encounters before. A seasoned law enforcement officer, he'd spent years working with wildlife management teams, responding to calls that required a delicate balance of authority and respect for nature. But nothing had prepared him for this particular assignment. The bear they were targeting had become dangerous, too accustomed to human proximity, and with food sources dwindling, it had started to see people as a potential threat or even prey. Today, the plan was simple: tranquilize and relocate the bear before it hurt anyone. Jennings and a small team of wildlife officers had been stationed at the edge of the dense forest near the outskirts of town. The air was thick with tension, the ground beneath their boots frozen and slick with patches of snow. They knew this was no ordinary relocation. The bear had been increasingly unpredictable. They had to approach carefully, precisely, and above all, be cautious not to provoke it. The team set up a perimeter, positioning themselves strategically, their eyes scanning the trees and underbrush for movement. Michael stood just a little too close to the tree line, an area often frequented by the bear. He couldn't help but feel a creeping unease. The tranquilizer dart was loaded and ready in his hand, but the wind had started to pick up, carrying with it the scent of pine and wet earth. The team was positioned to fire if needed, but they were waiting for the bear to show itself. Then, the snap of a branch broke the stillness. It was loud, sudden, and sharp. They all froze, the sound echoing through the quiet forest like a crack of thunder. The bear had appeared larger than expected, its hulking frame emerging from the thicket. Its dark, heavy eyes scanned the area. The team was momentarily paralyzed, locked in a silent standoff with the animal. Jennings' heart raced, and his training kicked in. The bear hadn't noticed them yet, but it was close enough that any sudden movement would provoke it. He motioned for the team to wait, the tranquilizer dart still aimed at the bear. But the animal had already detected something. The wind had shifted again, and with it came the unmistakable scent of humans. The grizzly's eyes locked onto the officers instantly, and in a heartbeat, it charged. The world erupted. Jennings barely had time to react before the massive beast was upon him. Its power was a force of nature, its claws outstretched as it bore down on him with terrifying speed. He staggered back, but the snow beneath him betrayed him, sending him crashing to the ground. The impact knocked the wind out of him, but he managed to bring his rifle up just in time, though it was useless. Before he could fire, the bear was on top of him. The weight of the grizzly felt like a crushing avalanche, its body a wall of muscle and fury. The team fired warning shots, hoping to scare the animal off. The loud cracks of gunfire echoed across the forest, cutting through the chaos. But the bear didn't falter. It was too close to Jennings, enraged and wild. Its claws raked across his chest, tearing through his heavy jacket and deep into his flesh. The growls of the bear drowned out the sound of ripping fabric and the sickening crunch of bone as it attacked. The officers scrambled, attempting to fire the tranquilizer darts, but they had no clear shot. Struggling beneath the beast, Jennings pushed one arm free, but the grizzly's jaws clamped onto his leg, pulling him further into the snow. The pain was unimaginable. He fought back with everything he had, kicking, pushing, trying to break free. but the bear's grip was unrelenting. The animal's breath was hot on his face, the stench of blood and fur overwhelming. The team fired once more, this time with deadly intent, and the bear let out a horrific guttural roar. It turned away from Jennings, distracted momentarily by the gunshots. But it was too late. He had already been crushed under the weight of the animal's savage assault. With no time to waste, one of the wildlife officers rushed to Michael's side, pulling him out from under the bear's retreating form. But there was little they could do. Blood stained the snow around him, and the wound on his leg had been severe. He was already losing consciousness. The officers worked frantically, dragging him toward the waiting transport vehicle. They called for a helicopter to airlift him to the hospital, and the panic cleared in their eyes. The journey to the hospital was a blur, emergency lights flashing in the snowstorm, sirens wailing through the cold air, the helicopter blades cutting through the sky. But despite all their efforts, Michael Jennings didn't survive. The injuries were too severe, too deep. By the time he reached the hospital, he was already gone. The bear's attack had been swift, brutal, and final. Shaken and exhausted, the wildlife team tracked the bear through the snow for hours. Eventually, authorities located it, and the bear was euthanized. Its unusual behavior and increasing proximity to human settlements left officials with no alternative. Though difficult, the decision was made to ensure public safety as a stark reminder of the fragile balance between wildlife and human habitation in Wyoming's rugged terrain. The loss of Officer Michael Jennings hit the community hard. He had been a well-respected law enforcement team member, and everyone who had worked with him knew his commitment to his work and his love for the land he protected. His death was a painful reminder of the thin line between man and nature, of how the very wilderness that officers were meant to preserve could so easily turn against them when circumstances were misunderstood, or worse, ignored. In the aftermath, the Wyoming Wildlife Management Team reevaluated its approach to handling aggressive wildlife. More protocols were put in place, more caution, and more distance between human settlements and the animals they were tasked with relocating. While the dangers of working in such a wild and untamed environment were well understood, no amount of training could have prepared them for the ferocity with which the bear had acted. Michael Jennings' family, colleagues, and community mourned his loss. The story of his sacrifice and the heroism displayed in the line of duty would echo for years. Though the bear was gone, its memory remained, a grim reminder of the risks of trying to coexist with the wilderness. The night air in the Alaskan wilderness was thick with the hum of insects and the distant cry of unseen creatures. The sky above was a stretch of ink, dotted with stars that pierced the darkness, casting an otherworldly glow over the land. The landscape was vast, untamed, and quiet. Only the wind dared to stir the tall grasses, swaying like a restless sea beneath the looming mountains of a national park in south-central Alaska. The stream that cut through the valley murmured, the steady flow of water filling the silence with a peaceful rhythmic sound. It was July 25th, 2023, and Adam and Lily Reed had set up camp beside the stream, a perfect spot, they thought, far enough from civilization to feel the rawness of nature, yet close enough to the water for convenience. They were in their late 30s, seasoned hikers, drawn to the wild beauty of Alaska's backcountry. They had prepared well for their camping trip, making sure to store food properly, but the landscape was unfamiliar, and the presence of grizzlies in the area was something they hadn't fully accounted for. The couple had spent the day hiking through the rugged terrain, their legs sore but their spirits high. Their tent was small but comfortable, nestled between two massive boulders that formed a natural barrier. They had eaten a modest dinner, a light meal that left them satisfied but not heavy, and crawled into the tent early, eager to rest before another day of adventure. The fire had long since died down, its faint glow nothing more than a memory in the cold night air. The only light now came from the flickering stars above, casting a pale reflection off the stream's surface. As they settled into their sleeping bags, their world seemed peaceful, a perfect end to an adventurous day. But beneath the tranquility of the landscape, a danger was moving closer, unseen by the couple and unnoticed by the world. Somewhere in the thick underbrush, a grizzly bear was prowling. Hungry, driven by the gnawing emptiness of an insatiable appetite, the bear's keen nose caught the scent of food. The faint trace of leftovers from Adam and Lily's meal, a slight residue carried by the wind, was enough to draw the massive predator in. It moved slowly, deliberately, its heavy paws sinking into the earth, crushing foliage with each step. The bear's senses were sharp, attuned to every movement in its territory, and it had already identified the camp, its focus narrowing with each breath. The couple, blissfully unaware of the danger, slept soundly in the tent. The fabric that separated them from the wilderness offered no real protection. It was a mere veil, too thin to keep out the larger creatures of the wild. With its enormous bulk and strength, the bear was undeterred by the flimsy barrier between it and its prey. It approached silently, its massive form blending into the shadows cast by the trees, a predator on the prowl. Then, with a sudden and terrifying force, the bear struck. It was a blur of claws and fury. The grizzly's massive paws tore through the tense fabric with terrifying ease. The ripping sound of fabric was deafening in the stillness of the night. Adam and Lily, jerked awake by the violence, barely had time to process what was happening before the bear was upon them. They were trapped, the walls of their tent offering no escape as the bear's enormous body crashed into them. The grizzly's claws raked across their skin, its weight forcing them deeper into the fabric, its breath hot and rancid. Adam fought mindlessly, grasping for anything to defend himself. The bear struck again, claws slicing his arm. Lily screamed, but the bear's jaws clamped down on Adam's shoulder, ripping through flesh with brutal force. His body convulsed as the beast tore into him. Lily, panicked, struggled beneath the weight of the grizzly. She shoved at it, but the animal was too strong. It lunged, sinking its teeth into her leg. Pain shot through her as it lifted and flung her against the collapsed tent. She gasped, but the bear didn't hesitate. It was hungry. It killed without thought, driven by instinct. The attack lasted seconds. Adam and Lily lay motionless, tangled in the wreckage. A satisfied bear sniffed the air, then turned and disappeared into the night, leaving only blood in its wake. Silence followed. The camp, once a refuge, felt like a grave, and the stream flowed on, indifferent. Morning brought no relief. A rescue team arrived at dawn, responding to the couple's missed check-in. They found the tent shredded, the camp eerily still. Blood soaked the ground. The bodies were mauled beyond recognition. It was a scene of raw, merciless nature, a swift, brutal death at the hands of a predator. The bear's tracks were visible, large and deep in the soft earth. The rescue team could trace them for a while. But as they ventured further into the wilderness, the snow from the night before had already begun to cover the tracks. The bear had vanished as if it had never been there. Wildlife authorities were called in, and the hunt for the grizzly began. After an extensive search, the bear was located and later killed by wildlife authorities. The tragedy sent shockwaves through the community and beyond, a grim reminder that the wilderness, long seen as untamed yet safe, could be unpredictably dangerous. In the aftermath, the event immediately re-evaluated camping regulations in bear habitats. Measures were implemented to ensure campers were better prepared, with stricter guidelines on food storage, tent placement, and safety procedures in bear country. For the village nearby, the tragedy was a wake-up call. The wilderness was not to be taken lightly. A hungry bear could turn a peaceful night of camping into a deadly encounter. For Adam and Lily, it was a final, silent reminder of the dangers lurking just beyond the veil of nature's beauty. Their names would live on in the records, a testament to the wild power of Alaska's backcountry, a power that could never be tamed, only respected. The Kenai Peninsula in Alaska had always been a haven for those who sought solitude, where the wilderness stretched for miles without interruption and nature held sway. It was July 28th, 2023, and the thick scent of pine and fresh water filled the air as two fishermen, Jack and Eli, made their way through a small clearing beside a remote stream. Low on the horizon, the sun painted the landscape in muted golds and greens. The tranquility of the setting seemed almost surreal, a perfect escape for the two experienced outdoors people. They were no strangers to the rugged beauty of Alaska, having spent years fishing the waters of the Kenai Peninsula. Their routine was simple yet fulfilling. They set up camp by the edge of the stream, casting their lines into the clear, cold water, waiting for the tug of a fish. The world around them was quiet, the only sounds being the rustling of leaves and the occasional splash as a fish broke the surface. They were well practiced, moving silently, respecting the land as they always did. Their routine had become second nature, almost invisible to the wildlife that called the peninsula home. But that silence, the stillness that made the place so serene, also made it dangerous. The bears, especially grizzlies, roamed these lands with little concern for human activity. It wasn't uncommon to encounter them, but for the most part, they kept their distance, drawn more to the scent of fish and the dense thickets of the surrounding forest than to the fishermen themselves. Jack and Eli had seen their fair share of bears, but none had ever approached them closely. It was a distant respect, an unspoken understanding between man and beast. As the evening drew on, the men prepared to pack their gear, their fishing rods idle beside them. They hadn't caught much that day, but the time spent in such a remote and peaceful place was enough. The steady rhythm of the stream, the call of distant birds, and the rustling of the trees all contributed to a sense of contentment. It was time to return to camp and leave the forest before the light disappeared. Suddenly, a movement from the bushes broke the calm. A shift in the underbrush, a thud of heavy footsteps on the ground. Before either man had time to process the change, the grizzly appeared from the trees, its massive form emerging from the foliage like a shadow. The bear's eyes were locked on them, its fur bristling in the evening air. The animal's size was overwhelming, and its presence was an immediate threat. It was no more than 10 yards away. Jack's hand instinctively shot toward his fishing rod. The long, sturdy pole was the only thing within reach that might serve as a weapon. He gripped it tightly, his heart hammering in his chest, his eyes scanning the bear's movements. Eli, standing just a few feet away, froze. His eyes were wide with fear, his mind working in overdrive. They knew enough to understand the danger. The bear was too close and agitated. The beast lunged. The speed at which it charged was unlike anything the men had ever witnessed. The bear covered the distance between them in seconds, its massive paws swiping through the air and its jaws snapping with a hunger that left no room for hesitation. Still gripping the rod, Jack swung it in a desperate attempt to defend himself. The weight of the bear's body collided with him, knocking him off his feet and into the stream. The cold water engulfed him, his legs buckling beneath him as the force of the impact left him disoriented. He struggled to regain his balance, water splashing violently around him, but the bear was already on Eli. Eli's scream was a guttural, raw sound, lost in the moment's fury. The bear's claws slashed through the air, raking across his chest, tearing through his jacket and skin, with an efficiency born of years of survival in this harsh land. Eli staggered backward, trying to shield his face with his arms, but the bear pressed on, its massive weight forcing him to the ground. The pain was excruciating, a hot, burning sensation spreading across his chest as the blood flowed freely. Jack, fighting to stay upright in the knee-deep water, saw Eli's peril and tried to push himself up. His leg buckled under him, the sudden pain sharp and overwhelming. He'd heard the snap, the sickening crack of bone breaking beneath the pressure. His right leg, shattered and useless, refused to support his weight. Eli, still pinned beneath the bear, struggled weakly. His arms flailed, but his attempts to push the animal away were futile. The grizzly's strength was beyond anything he could fight against. Its jaws sunk deeper into his chest, and its claws dug into his flesh. Through the pain and the panic, Jack fought to keep his focus. He swung the rod again, this time hitting the bear's side desperately. The impact did little to deter the creature, but it seemed to shift its attention momentarily. The bear's massive head swung toward Jack, its eyes narrowing, sensing that the true threat now lay in the water. Jack's heart pounded in his ears as he struggled to crawl forward, his broken leg dragging uselessly behind him. The grizzly, still wary, paused, giving Jack a fraction of a second. It was all the opening he needed. With every ounce of strength left in his body, Jack reached for a nearby rock, hefting it with both hands and hurling it toward the bear. The stone struck the bear's face, the impact's noise cutting through the moment's chaos. The bear growled, its attention now fully diverted. With a final swipe at Eli's chest, it turned and began to retreat, disappearing into the tree. Its massive form faded into the forest's shadows. Jack lay in the freezing water, his body trembling from shock, his leg mangled and useless. Eli, pale and bloodied, gasped for air, his chest rising in shallow, pained breaths. Due to their remote location, help was slow to arrive. With no immediate assistance, Jack was forced to drag Eli to the bank, desperate for rescue. Hours passed before a helicopter finally arrived, airlifting them to safety. Eli suffered deep lacerations that required weeks of recovery. Jack's compound fracture needed immediate surgery. The attack left them both scarred, physically and mentally. Days later, authorities tracked and euthanized the bear. It had been defending its territory. The attack was a brutal reminder that nature is unpredictable and unforgiving.